Have you ever watched a classic movie and just gotten this feeling that there's something more going on? A kind of secret language just beneath the surface. Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and decode a hidden layer of Hollywood history.
Yeah, if you've ever felt that, you are not imagining things. For decades, filmmakers had to embed these secret messages into their movies. It was this brilliant and honestly necessary act of creative rebellion, a way to tell stories that were officially completely forbidden.
And this practice, which you gotta remember was born out of pure necessity, became this absolutely essential tool. It was like a direct line of communication to a very specific part of the audience, the ones who could hear the whispers between the lines, the people who really understood the language of subtext. I mean, think about it. In their day-to-day lives, queer people often relied on subtle codes just to find each other safely. You know, a certain color, a specific turn of phrase. So when they sat down in a dark theater, they were already fluent in this language, catching messages that flew right over the heads of the mainstream. And, most importantly, the censors.
And this was not just a one-way street. Check this out. This quote from way back in 1919 shows that audiences were totally in on it. A fan who called herself the Mystic Rose writes into a magazine, and the editors clock her special fascination with actresses like the famously queer Alla Nazimova. It just shows that this conversation between the creator and the knowing audience was happening right out in the open.
So, you might be wondering, why was this secret language even a thing? Why did they need it? Well, to understand that, we have to travel back to an earlier and, surprisingly liberated Hollywood, a time before the censors marched in.
You know, the silent era and the early talkies, they could be, well, shockingly frank. Before this rigid moral code came and slammed the door shut, filmmakers were free to explore all kinds of complex themes and characters, including some really candid portrayals of same-sex desire. And Wings, it's the perfect example of this. It won Best Picture, and it features a love story between two men that's just central to the plot. The emotional climax is this absolutely groundbreaking on-screen kiss. And this wasn't played for laughs, not at all. This was for genuine, tragic love. It's pretty astonishing to see this level of directness, something that would become basically unthinkable just a few years later.
And look, this openness wasn't just happening in the scripts. It was being driven by the powerful creators working behind the scenes. Queer artists weren't just showing up in movies, they were building the very foundations of Hollywood itself.
Just take Alla Nazimova, for instance. She was an absolute powerhouse who produced her own films and cultivated this community of queer women. She even coined this playful term for them, the sewing circle. Her influence just goes to show how integrated queer life was in early Hollywood. But, as you can probably guess, this era of relative freedom, well, it was about to come to a really abrupt end.
Yeah, all this liberation, it sparked a major moral backlash. Fearing government intervention and getting pressured by conservative groups, Hollywood decided to police itself, and that led to one of the most restrictive censorship campaigns in the history of film.
I mean, the arrival of the Hays Code in 1934, it created this stark dividing line in film history. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a brick wall. All that openness from the pre-code era was suddenly forced deep, deep underground, and a new coded language had to be invented on the fly. So here's the absolute kicker. This single line made any direct portrayal of queer characters totally impossible for more than 30 years. Inference, that's the key word here. Not just the depiction, but even a hint was officially banned. It forced all that creativity to go completely covert. But you know what they say, right? Restriction breeds creativity. For the next 3 decades, queer artists, writers, and directors embedded their stories right under the noses of the censors. They found these clever, subtle ways to keep speaking that secret language. So how'd they do it? Well, they developed this whole toolkit of signals. Things like symbolism, a business card that just happens to smell of gardenias in the Maltese Falcon. Or specific mannerisms, which helped create the whole sharp-tongued gay best friend trope. And sometimes a simple, repeated gesture, like lighting a cigarette in a very particular way, could communicate an entire forbidden romance. Okay, this step-by-step breakdown of Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity is just a masterclass in coding. You've got the intense bond, this repeated intimate gesture of lighting the cigarette, and then that final devastating confession. It lays out an entire queer romance that could never, ever be stated outright. The subtext basically becomes the actual text, if you know how to look for it.
And it's so important to remember that this code wasn't just on the page, it was alive in the people who were actually making the films. They brought their own lived experiences, their own understanding of subtext, to their work. And they enriched these films with layers the censors would never, ever catch.
Dorothy Arzner is such a phenomenal example of this. As the only woman consistently directing in the studio system for years, she was a true trailblazer. She lived openly, and her forthright butch style, paradoxically, it was actually seen as an asset. In this total boys club, she commanded respect and wasn't seen as a romantic prospect, which allowed her to just focus on her craft. Her career is powerful proof that this hidden history was actively being shaped by queer people in positions of real power.
So, okay, why are we talking about all this? Why does learning this hidden language actually matter? Well, because it's not just some film trivia. It really reshapes how we understand our own cultural history.
Because what this history really shows us is this incredible legacy of artistic survival. It proves that even under the most oppressive censorship, storytelling finds a way. These creators refused to be erased. They embedded their truths into the very fabric of the films we now call classics.
And once you learn to recognize the signs, that lingering glance, the double meaning in a line, the symbolic gesture, these classic films just open up in completely new ways. It reminds us that our stories have always existed, and that audiences have always been there to find them, even when they had to search between the frames.
So the next time you settle in to watch a classic, I'm going to challenge you. Look a little deeper. Listen for what's not being said out loud. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told in the silence, just waiting for you to find them.